welcome to the Behavior Education Connection, the podcast that works to connect the world of behavior analysis and the world of education. We focus on topics important to behavior analysts who work in the public schools and those who support them. Join us and spend time gaining insights and ideas as our host talks with fellow behavior analysts as well as other experts in the field. Welcome to our new episode. Today I am with Hayley Mullins from Campbell County Public Schools. Hayley, I'm so glad to have you with me. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good morning, Selena. As you said, I work with Campbell County Public Schools, which is right outside of the Lynchburg area. I've been practicing as a behavior analyst for almost 10 years now, and began first as a classroom teacher in an aligned curriculum classroom, and have since served as the autism and behavior specialist for the division, and now I currently serve as the coordinator of special ed for the division.
So you're busy.
It's all fun. It's a good busy.
Well, that's always good. Well, I really appreciate you being here today with me. We're going to talk about self-care and this idea about behavior analysts. You know, it's hard to be a behavior analyst sometimes, and particularly in a public school setting. So we need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves so that we don't get burned out. I do want to give a little caveat that neither Hayley nor I are giving professional advice today. We're just talking about kind of our personal experiences and some things that we have found helpful. So this definitely doesn't constitute medical advice by any means, but I think it'll be a good conversation. So
absolutely, and I think very timely.
Yeah, definitely. So Hayley, I'm just going to start out. What is, we are behavior analysts, so we like to operationalize everything, right? So what is burnout, and why is it something that we really do need to be aware of?
Absolutely. So when we talk about burnout, the first thing that I think about are common antecedents for burnout behavior. And one of the clearest triggers that I feel as though we experience is really a stressor or stress-related response. And that stress may be something that is short-term and just very intense, or perhaps a pervasive longer-term stressor in our professional or personal lives that just really lead to a manifestation of very different behaviors, ranging from fatigue. Perhaps we feel a little less motivated or excited about the work that we're doing, or even some disengagement or negativity or irritability. Can certainly be behaviors that are indicators that perhaps we're either burnout or approaching that burnout. I feel like for our personal practices as behavior analysts, we may be more predisposed to burnout for a couple of different reasons. As behavior analysts, we're often engaging in very high intensity situations, and whether they are directly related to student behavior, perhaps supporting staff members that have very strong personalities, needs, and opinions, or even sitting on that, highly contentious team in which there are a lot of just different goals. We're more likely to be involved in those higher intensity situations. So a lot of stress in our daily work. But I also think that by nature of our practice in the public schools, where we may not necessarily have a group of behavior analysts readily available, we certainly don't necessarily all have like a grade level or a group of professional practitioners that we can just have as our core group at the ready. We're more likely to experience isolation. And then sometimes that can then perpetuate any feelings of burnout to where they just grow and sort of snowball.
Yeah, I think, it's funny you're mentioning some of these behaviors, irritability or disengagement, or even just less motivation, perhaps. I think we all experience some of those at times. But this idea that it's pervasive, right? That it's not like I had a bad day today. I mean, we all have bad days, but this idea that it doesn't just go away because the next day comes. But I like your point, particularly about that isolation possibility. I think that's unique to a lot of behavior analysts that work in public schools because we're not exactly teachers and we're not exactly administrators and we're not exactly anything else.
Right.
And so we can sometimes feel a little alone if we don't have another behavior analyst at the ready.
Absolutely.
So then how do we avoid this? I mean, I think, any behavior analyst wants to prevent behavior if we can. So how can we prevent burnout?
Well, one of the things that I think about in avoiding or preventing burnout is thinking about those things that are motivating or perhaps reinforcing to our own practice. And so for us, I think about what is our productive output. And for each of us, I think that it's important that we first operationally define what is productivity. When I feel productive, that I am being a good practitioner, what does that look like? What are my expectations of myself? To lead to that. So sometimes we're really unclear of what we think is productive and what our productivity should be, so that sometimes when we're floundering and feeling very scattered or not as productive, we don't know how to recenter it because we don't have a good operational definition for
Mhm.
ourselves. The other thing that comes to mind too is that once we operationally define productivity, um, recognizing that productivity is not measured by the number of items that we check off a list.
But
And I
no, that's
think,
hard. That's hard
yeah,
for
oh,
us.
I know. And especially when we are so data driven, thinking about concretely identifying what did we do today? How many things did I check off my checklist? And I think in a current COVID situation, this is even more so prevalent because we are now gauging our worth on the number of emails that we answer, the number of phone calls that we respond to, or the number of Zoom meetings that we schedule. And so recognizing that my productivity is not measured by the number of items I check off a list, I am also responsible for big picture goals, long-term planning, and things that really excite me versus just that checklist manifesto.
Yeah, I said it. That is so hard for us, right? I mean, I think I'll speak for myself. I love checking my to-do list off. It brings
Absolutely.
me great joy. And I love like tossing it when I'm done with it.
Yes. Yes.
Um, but you're right. I think, and if we are going to use a checklist, then I think we need to be realistic in what those items are. This is something that I've learned. I used to write things like, um, I'm being completely ridiculous, but like solve world peace. And then that was my to do for the day. And that's ridiculous. You're not going to do that in a day. And so, using our good behavior analytics skills, breaking those tasks down into something that is manageable,
Absolutely. And
maybe go ahead. I'm
well, I
sorry.
was going to say, you bring up a great point, though, in balancing that sometimes we view checklists as solely like a daily to-do list. And that's wonderful because it helps us build momentum. I got these 5 things done today. Great job. But we also have to be excited about those midterm, mid and long range plans like world, solving, world peace, because those are the things that allow us to be sustainable as opposed to just a 9 to 5 practitioner that just, these are the things that I did today. So I think that though, to your point, those longer big picture plans can be just as valuable as those smaller, minute pieces of a day to day.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the long-term things are, for me, what I get excited about,
Mhm.
right? Like I love the idea of thinking, oh, in a year this will look like this, or I'll get this project done, or whatever the case may be. Um, but then that can be also exciting and overwhelming.
Mhm.
And so you're right, that balance of the long-term goal and the short-term to-dos.
Yep,
And how do we
absolutely,
chip away at the long-term goal so we're actually getting momentum forward?
absolutely.
So we've talked about preventing it, but unfortunately, I think this is something that we all experience at some point, to varying degrees, clearly. But what are some practical tips you can share if you are feeling like you're experiencing burnout or you're heading in that direction?
Absolutely. So I think that one of the best gifts that we can give ourselves is permission to be human and worthy of self-care. Recognizing that it is okay not to be okay, especially in our current state of affairs with COVID and where we are, that it's okay to be human and to be worthy of that self-care. And recognizing in that, that taking care of yourself is actually a valid piece of your professional practice. You can maximize your effectiveness and efficiency when you are in a very sound space caring for yourself. I think of some maybe key indicators that really made me feel uncomfortable when I first started practicing as a behavior analyst. Building time into your calendar to recharge. And this may include professionally recharging. So I literally had to put on my weekly calendar a period of time that I was dedicating to reading professional journals, because that was something in my day-to-day practice I always said I wanted to do, but I wasn't
Right.
able to do that. So that allowed me to professionally recharge. The same thing now that I allow myself at the end of the day to have just some quiet time to reflect and sort of do a personal check-in with myself. How am I feeling? Am I approaching my a burnout state? um, what have things, what's been going on, and how have I been feeling over the last several weeks, those types of things. So giving yourself those times. And then also, one thing that was just so fascinating to me is that when I finally started reflecting and also recognizing that I may need some time to do some things differently for recharge, I was actually unable to identify what what those activities may be. Um,
I don't think you're alone in that.
and that was fascinating to me, that if somebody said, well, what do you do to recharge? I was not able to answer that question. So I encourage anyone listening today to just, can you identify a couple of basic activities that really give you that recharge, and then engage in them. But first, we've got to be able to identify them. And it's not doing the laundry, and it's not answering email.
Right, right. Yeah, I think you're right. I before COVID, I had a commute during the day, and so I didn't realize until COVID came along how much that time allowed me to kind of recenter. And I mean, I do lots of things. I mean, I listen to things in the car, and it's not like it's silent, but I didn't realize how much that time was giving me to kind of do my reflection on the day and think through where do I want to, put my efforts, and I'm a planner, so I need to have that time to plan. And so now with COVID and life things changing, I've had to figure out how to fit that in and where it fits and how to do that.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up a really key point, that COVID has really impacted our need to engage in more self-care, or different forms of self-care. So
Yeah,
some,
the different part I think is super important, because we may not have the access to do what we used to do.
yeah,
Um, and and that just yeah, I think there's just been changes, and so things that were how we were taking care of ourselves, may not be working right now, and
right.
that's okay. But then to your point, we have to identify some things that will work for us.
Absolutely. And I think of even some of the changes that for many of us now potentially working remotely or in a more remote state than, previously, we've potentially increased our workload. There is no
For
20-minute
sure.
commute in between schools, or, time in between meetings to readjust, recenter. It is now click off Zoom, and in 2 minutes, I may not even get a bathroom
I
break.
was just gonna say, let's
Um,
be honest, 20 minutes, you don't even have time to go to the restroom before you're back on another
Exactly.
meeting.
And then I think also it's worthy of us recognizing that there are a lot of unknown or changing expectations of us, even as just school personnel right now. Thinking about even a year ago, virtual instruction was something of the future, and then all of a sudden we're automatically thrown into, well, this is what we need to do, but we don't know how to do it. So this constant revolution of, okay, now we're doing this, now we're expected to do this, or we've got to figure this out, has really put a lot of pressure on us, to
Mhm.
perform and be just all in, ready to go and do, what teachers administrators and kids and families need right now.
And
I
then add, we may or may not even have the supports to do that. And
right.
that's the other part.
Absolutely. And in all of that, I think that when we don't have perhaps a clear expectation, or there are a lot of unknowns about what is my role and what am I supposed to be doing right now and how can I figure that out, I think we revert to many of those oriented activities, such as checking my email all the time and answering every phone call, and things that under normal circumstances we wouldn't be doing, but it makes us feel perhaps a little bit more safe and productive, that okay, at least I'm checking my email and I'm responding to someone.
Right.
So I think um, when we're talking about this change with COVID, how we do have to readjust and perhaps engage in some different activities for that self-care. Some of the simplest things that I have personally experienced have been things like having my own like norms about checking email. Um, I feel like under normal circumstances and in our initial COVID world, it was very much my email was just on one of my screens, and just perpetually I was just, as emails were coming in, checking and checking. Well, that's not realistic, and it's not helping me be effective and efficient.
Right.
So I only check email, on the top of the hour, unless I get, some sort of random, priority inquiry that suggests that I need to turn on my email. But I actively turn it off and then turn it back on, so I'm not habitually just watching my email flood in. I also have really benefited from visualizing how I want the day to look and to feel. So, what is productivity to me? What is relaxing look like to me? And I feel as though if I can see myself engaging in some of these very intentional, well planned work behaviors and personal behaviors, that I'm more likely to actually engage in them, because I thought about it ahead of time. This is what I want my day to feel like and look like. And finally, I think that it's interesting that you identified that like listening to music and listening to different things is your form of maybe resetting and self-care. I've actually found just the opposite recently, that listening to things in the car I'd normally listen to, preferred music station or something like that, while I liked it, it really wasn't giving me that respite and quiet that I needed to be able to be a good professional, spouse and parent. So I've actually started turning off the radio between transitions and just being quiet. And being quiet can be scary, but it can also allow us to reset and care for ourselves just a little bit emotionally.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, we're all different. So it's not like we can sit here and say, do this, this, and this, and then you'll feel better or
Right.
you'll avoid burnout but I do really like your point about taking some conscientious time to say, what is it that makes me feel better as a professional, better as a person? What is it that I really do need?
Absolutely.
Because I don't know that I can honestly say I had never really thought about it before some of the things that I was used to having were taken away.
That is a great point. When did we ever talk about self-care? And it's not that we weren't in need of it. It's just that
Exactly.
it, I don't know. I can't say why, all of a sudden talking about, other than we're recognizing that right now, the majority of us may not be fully okay, because our worlds have just shifted so dramatically. And now we've really got to um, intentionally and reflectively identify how to recenter ourselves in our new world.
Well, and as we make another transition to whatever that may be, and that's still unfolding, but as we make the next transition, I think it is important to be mindful of continuing this thought
Mhm.
process and continuing this conversation with ourselves. And so I guess what I would ask is, as BCBAs are entering public education, how do we how do they think about self-care to make sure that they're not reaching burnout? Because we don't want people to start and then leave a year later. That's not helpful for anybody. And then I guess the second part to this question is, are there things that maybe those of us who are already in the field can do to support people who are in this kind of situation?
Absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is really the our responsibility to find our community, and then
Yeah.
likewise to identify those perhaps new BCBAs, new staff members, and create a community for them. So I think community is a critical component for that. Now, I think that there is absolutely benefit in finding a behavior analytic community. And whether that's within your school division, in your region, or even with maybe privately practicing BCBAs. I have some really dear friends that I can, just call up, and they just, they speak my language and they get
Right. Right. Yeah.
but I also think that we can't discount or be so narrow focused in who our community could be, because in the public schools, we are so multifaceted. I also think that it's just equally as important that we find ourselves in a really positive community of multidisciplinary practitioners. So other teachers, perhaps related service personnel, administrators or specialists that may not get your behavior analytic work, but have very homogeneous ideals, goals, and that positive outlook that can really help you reset. A third community that is really just something that I had never thought of, but has been so beneficial, is identifying perhaps other groups of people that have nothing to do with your practice. I think that sometimes, misery enjoys company. So when you may find yourself in some of those dark, deep holes, sometimes people who really get it are the worst people to be around, because they're like, yeah, I totally get you. And then it just sort of perpetuates some of those feelings of negativity, loneliness, unproductivity. So sometimes it's so nice just to talk to people who have no idea what the heck you're talking about, but they're able to be like, man, yeah, that just stinks, or change the topic because they don't understand. So I think that community sort of has to be that three-prong approach. I also think it's important for us to self-manage and be very just cognizant of common triggers and signals that lead to our own burnout. That's going to be different for each person,
Hmm.
but it can help us self-manage and respond to our environment when we know that burnout is more likely, or that this is how I typically feel at the onset of some burnout, and I can make some adjustments.
Well, Haley, I think those are all wonderful recommendations. And I really do appreciate you spending some time with us today. I think this was a great conversation. Is there anything that you want to add before we end today?
Recognize, I think all of us on the line, recognize that you're not alone, that it's okay to feel burnout, tired, floundering. But there are others here that within the state of Virginia and beyond that get it, and that recognize that in order to be the best behavioral analysts that we can possibly be, we've got to first care for ourselves. So
Well, I can't agree more. And I really do appreciate you joining me today. Hayley Mullins from Campbell County Public Schools. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I hope that our listeners enjoyed. And I will hopefully talk to you again soon. And I'll talk to our listeners again soon too. Thank you.
thanks, Selena.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Behavior Education Connection. Join us next time for another great conversation about behavior analysis in the schools. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on an episode. Sending out a special thanks to the Virginia Department of Education for supporting our work. We look forward to connecting with you all again soon.